As I mentioned to Costa, I think he was getting onto some interesting material at the end of our first session. And so I'd like to sort of continue with that, because one of the points in your presentation I thought was worth exploring. You said we could be reducing more external transportation costs with less money, and looking at certainly the environmental impact in a place like California. So I'd like to see, could you propose, or what would, if you were designing a ZEV program today, or a program with the same goals of getting advanced vehicles out there, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, could you propose an alternative or modifications that you think might be more cost-effective or easier to do?
Okay. Well, there'd be a number of kind of near-term, mid-term, and long-term solutions that I would put together. I mean, I guess just like in traditional energy policy, there's not one solution that we need to deal with. There's a portfolio of options that we need to maximize the benefits from in terms of environment, the economy, and security. And the main issue here is driving down the cost of ZEVs. And how do we do that? The ZEV mandate has started doing that by getting manufacturers to put real cars on the road and like Annalisa said, butts in seats, right? I mean, that's part of the innovation ecosystem. That's the end of it. It's basically learning from real experiences and customer experiences on the ground. When I was referring to reducing more damages at less cost, that refers to either an oil tax, a gasoline tax, a carbon tax. Those do some things, like I said, they won't get a fuel cell vehicle or a BEV to market, but they do start to reduce some of the near-term damages why we're doing this in the first place. And then in the midterm, it's likely going to focus on those demand pull signals, or tax credits for EVs and FCVs and other ZEVs. But as I was saying, structuring those to maximize the benefits of the dollars that we're going to be spending. The federal plug-in hybrid tax credit program is estimated to cost between somewhere north of $1.5 billion. So you basically have $1.5 billion to play with, and you could do a certain number of big BEVs or a lot more smaller plug-in hybrids. And we found that the smaller plug-in hybrids, at least in the near term, are reducing more damages. That might be a better place to focus right now. Now, that doesn't obfuscate the need to do continue and enhance the massive R&D infrastructure, both from the federal and state level, to incentivize auto manufacturers to get these costs down. I mean, I think that should be our goal. That should be our moonshot, which is get these cars at the cost where they're on parity with other vehicles within a one-year payback period.
So when you mention smaller plug-ins, can you get a little more specific of what you have in mind? I know the work you've done with colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, you've spent a lot of time sort of looking at that. Where's the sweet spot, I guess, for battery and...
Yeah, I mean, so when I say smaller plug-ins, that's not a smaller vehicle. I mean kind of smaller batteries. And the sweet spot that we found is in the 10 to 20-ish mile all-electric range of a battery, and that would include the upcoming C-Max Energy from Ford. It would include the Prius PHEV. And it would include some of the other mild hybrid, mild plug-ins, I guess you might call them, that are being thought about in auto manufacturers around the country. Thinking about the first generation option, I have the option to drive on gasoline and plug in. I can cover the first 10, 15 miles of my daily commute with electricity. And as I go beyond that right now, the cost premiums are harder and harder to justify. So this would be a way to get a lot of vehicles on the road, learn from that experience, minimize technology risk, while still stimulating the long-term R&D of getting that BEV or that fuel cell vehicle down to cost parity.
And Jeremy, looking at the data that Edmunds has collected and your experience in this area, what's the sweet spot, basically, for these products? Everything that's come to market so far, the Leaf, the Volt, Prius plug-in, $30,000 and up. Now, more recently, we have some very attractive lease deals on those. But absent federal tax credits and California rebates, we're talking about a class of vehicles with sticker prices north of $30,000. So to really get a mass market interested in these particular products, is there a magic price number, price point that manufacturers have to hit?
Well, I think there's three issues that you've kind of touched on there. And so let's explore them. I think one of the issues that we're dealing with is that the target is moving. And by that I mean that the more traditional powertrains, the advanced internal combustion engine powertrains, continue to get better and better and better. So as we see some sort of benefit being offered via a plug-in hybrid or electric vehicle, it's competing against a better and better internal combustion engine powered vehicle. And so the delta that could be offered to consumers in terms of fuel savings or whatever it might be isn't that significant. So I think that's number one. I think that by throwing incentives into the marketplace, it's one way to get consumers' attention. It certainly creates a little bit perhaps more market pull, but there's also a stigma attached to incentives, and it's kind of interesting to me because I remember when the 3 Detroit auto company executives were testifying before Congress back in 2008, and they were getting pounded on relying on incentives to move vehicles, and this is such a bad thing for the brand, and yet now we have a lot of incentives on what should be perceived as very desirable vehicles, and yet we're kind of creating a bit, I think it's an unintended consequence, that when you throw a lot of incentives on the vehicle, one of the messages that consumers get is that, gee, maybe there's something wrong with that vehicle. Why are they throwing so much money on it? It creates some doubt, and that's something that I think we kind of need to be aware of. And the third thing, and I just keep kind of going back to this, is that, and I think Costa did a great job of enumerating these externalities, the fact that the reason that we're even here talking about all of this is that there's damage done by individual motorists, and on an individual level, we're just not that sensitive to it. It's not that we don't care, but you can rationally look at like what you're doing as a motorist individually, or what I'm doing as a motorist individually in terms of environmental damage or energy security, and on an individual basis, it's just not that significant.
Do you mean in terms of their choice of vehicle, their driving habits, or?
It's just the fact that driving a vehicle has external damages associated with it. And I think, as I said, I think Costa did a really good job of sort of listing all those. But on an individual basis, it's really not that significant. So it's not completely irrational for us to not be paying that much attention to it. The damage is on an aggregate basis when you look at all the motorists out there, and it's not even just the new vehicles, which is what we're focusing on today, but what about all the older vehicles out there which have even probably, arguably a greater damage. It just keeps me coming back to how do we align the consumer interests or consumers' focus to some of these broader issues. And the only way I can really think of doing it that gets people's attention is with some sort of a premium associated with the price of gasoline, which I know gets people a little stressed out. Every time I do an op-ed piece or an interview and I talk about gas taxes, I get threatened. You guys have been pretty mellow, so I appreciate it. But if you want to get people riled up, you mention, hey, let's put a gas tax on there, and you don't have to worry about the market will take care of all of this. You don't have to worry about trying to figure out infrastructure and R&D investments and all those things, because if you can create consumer demand for these technologies, believe me, car companies will be jumping through hoops to figure out how to meet it. And I just don't see a lot of kind of clear conversation around that. It's always dismissed. Well, gas tax is politically not going to happen. It's like, well, why not?
Well, let me add to that, as the old civil engineer in me is coming out, is that regardless of externalities or anything else we want to deal with the gas tax itself has not kept pace with inflation and building new infrastructure. So no matter if we have no new vehicles at all, Rand has done a number of studies on how to pay for infrastructure without new gas taxes, and whether that's mileage-based user fees or advanced tolling or something else. But just to pay for our existing roads, we're going to have to raise more revenue in some way or another.
Annalisa, I'd like to turn back to you and touch on a couple issues that haven't come up so far. And I want to get your take on this because I know there'll be some people attending that are thinking about some other technologies. Now, this doesn't fall specifically under the area of ZEV, one of them, but can you share a little of your take on the state of diesel in California, which has been a contentious issue for a number of years. The Germans have continued to push and advance their technology, and they now have California-compliant diesel models. But as you mentioned, long-term, CARB is continuing to look at ever tighter requirements on particulate pollution. So I know many auto writers always turn to, why not diesel? You get a terrific fuel economy boost, you get great performance, lower overall CO2 emissions. So why is California opposed to diesel, and why doesn't that have a bigger role?
We're not opposed to diesel. We're opposed to emissions. We set performance-based standards for our overall fleet requirements. And as you said, the car companies have been able to meet those standards most recently with models, with diesel models, and have indicated they're okay with the latest revisions to the ZEV regulation, and still expect to be able to bring product. So we've set the target, and they keep working towards it. And there is also the possibility of combining diesel powertrains with advanced technology electric drive as well, which will help in a whole facet of environmental goals.
So is that, are we likely to see that more on the commercial vehicle side or on the light vehicle side?
On the light duty,
Okay.
yeah. Well, in terms of combining, we're seeing that more on the other sectors, the heavy duty, but it still remains a possibility, although it's been described as too expensive sets of technology put together.
Right. And that seems to be the issue with diesel long-term. To meet ever tougher regulations in California, the amount of cost that has to go in to the emissions treatment makes it sort of prohibitive. But do you believe at this point, based on what you're hearing from Volkswagen and Daimler, that long-term diesel is going to stay in the light duty?
It's still part of the light duty solution, yeah.
Right. And another technology option that might be of interest, CNG. There's some movement there on the light-duty side. Honda, of course, has been there consistently, and now we have GM and Chrysler and maybe Ford, I think, getting in. But what would be the issue from CARB's perspective of a CNG hybrid, which would seem to have a pretty attractive, I mean, there's a lot of cost involved, obviously,
Yeah.
but would seem to have a pretty attractive environmental profile?
And that would be certainly welcome. That would be an interesting mix of technologies within the zero-emission vehicle regulation up until 2017. It would be an advanced technology, partial zero-emission vehicle, and I have to apologize for our alphabet soup. We tried to simplify that in the latest revisions because it's using a compressed fuel which has complementary technology attributes that lead to hydrogen, as well as the hybridization, so it's got battery technology on board, which leads to stronger hybrid and electric drive. So it would be treated very advantageously in the regulation up until 2017, and then compressed natural gas. Unless it had plug-in capability, it would drop out of the program and just be considered under the low-emission vehicle regulation.
So
a plug-in
CNG
hybrid would be a transitional zero-emission vehicle and treated similarly to the plug-in hybrids.
Okay.